Hey students, it's Ms. Shofty here. We're going to talk a little bit today about the causes of the American Revolution. So this is a Nearpod, but it's a Nearpod that I'm just going to kind of use as a PowerPoint to guide our discussion. In the assignment for this, which you'll do on Tuesday, September 22nd, there are questions that go along with this on a separate attachment. So these questions you're not necessarily answering. We're just going to kind of use this to guide our discussion. So make sure you answer the questions on the attachment, not on here. All right, so this is Causes of the American Revolution. And it's meant, just to kind of refresh your memory on the causes of the American Revolution, because you probably have talked about this in previous grade, maybe 5th grade. So here we go. So the objectives for this particular lesson is that you will be able to come up with and trace causes of the American Revolution that, by the time you take the assessment on October 12th, you will have a good grasp on what things caused the Revolutionary War. We are actually going to skip this slide and we're going to go straight to this. So this is important stuff that you need to know. Of course, the 13 British colonies were owned and controlled by the British government. Yes, the British government was, far away in Great Britain, but still a lot of what the British government did when they put taxes and other laws, they, were controlling the colonies. So that's important to note. So during this time period, King George III became king in 1760. At that time, Great Britain or England was growing very quickly. They were almost at constant war with some other European nation, and they were actually in debt. So debt is never good, especially if you are in massive debt, as they were. So King George III was the king of Great Britain at this time. So by this time that we're talking about, so we've skipped ahead, the colonies had been founded, and now we're skipping ahead to about the mid-1700s. The colonies were already about 150 years old, and each colony, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, North Carolina, they already had their own governments in place. So they were governing themselves, but then, of course, Great Britain was also trying to govern each one. So the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, started in 1754 and ended in 1763. If you are a good math student, as I'm sure your math teachers would say, 1754 to 1763 is not 7 years, but thus it is called the 7 Years' War, but also called the French and Indian War. So the war was fought all over the world, Europe, Asia, Africa, North America, between England and France and their colonies. So you actually heard about this already if you watched and listened to the screencast from Monday. You actually know that this was the French and Indian War, but it was actually fought between Great Britain and France and their colonies. So ultimately, Great Britain or England defeated the French at a great cost to both. So Great Britain gained a bunch of land. France lost a lot of land, at least in North America here, but they also incurred a lot more debt. So England felt that the American colonists should help pay for the war. Even though the colonists had, been helping with the war effort, they were still considered British colonists, so they were helping with the war effort. Great Britain wanted to tax them. And the colonists were really angry because they didn't want to be taxed. They had to help with the war. They had no choice. And so to tax them now, after they had fought a war for Great Britain against the French, they thought that was very unfair. Okay, we're going to skip the slide. The Stamp Act of 1765 was the first piece of legislation that put a tax on every piece of paper used in the colonies. And this was basically, taxation of the colonists to get some of that money back from, the war that they had just fought with France. A lot of these taxations are going to be about Great Britain getting profit back because they were extremely in debt. The colonists were angry because they were not asked if they would pay a tax. And the famous slogan, "No taxation without representation," was the biggest kind of problem that the colonists had. Now, keep in mind, some colonists actually were described as loyalists because they were actually very loyal to King George and the British government. Some colonists, obviously were patriots because they wanted to split from Great Britain and they wanted to be independent. So you had loyalists and patriots that were still both colonists, but some were loyal to the British government and some wanted to be independent. So taxation without representation made the colonists really, really angry. Don't tax us because we don't have any say in whether we should or should not be taxed. That's not fair. So the next slide is about the Sons of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty were a group of patriots, people that wanted to become independent from Great Britain, who actually did a lot of these kind of protests. Some were violent, some were not violent, but just really, annoying, like the Boston Tea Party. But the Sons of Liberty, they wanted to oppose the Stamp Act. They opposed a lot of taxes. So the Sons of Liberty attacked tax collectors, sometimes pouring hot tar and feathers on them, which was actually very violent. Most tax collectors would not stay in the British colonies because they were really fearful that they were going to get attacked. So there's the Sons of Liberty, these guys made up of people like Paul Revere, John Adams, Patrick Henry, and then there were also the Daughters of Liberty that took part. The Daughters of Liberty, their protest actions were not quite as violent. They were very subdued. So the Boston Massacre, this happened in March 1770. The colonists in Boston were, really very angry about the new taxes. Some of the actions, actually took place in specific colonies like Massachusetts, but some of them took place in, other colonies as well, but we just hear about the ones in like Massachusetts. So what happened in March 1770, there were a group of colonists who were insulting and throwing ice and snowballs at British troops. No one really knows who fired the first shot, but it basically ended in, the British redcoats, these guys, British redcoats, actually firing their weapons into the crowd of colonists and ended up killing 5 people. So the incident was used to make more colonists and to actually bring more colonists into, the Patriot side, ready to declare independence. we're actually going to talk about this cartoon. I know it's really hard to see this, but if you see this, it's a snake that has been chopped into pieces. And each piece is labeled with abbreviation for the colonies. So you have like Massachusetts, North Carolina, you have Virginia, and so on and so forth. Ben Franklin actually created this political cartoon. And his idea was that if I put this out there as a political cartoon, I'm basically saying if we don't join together as the 13 colonies, then there's no way that we're going to be successful against the great British government or the Great British Army. So his idea was to say, join me in this fight or we're all going to die. Pretty dramatic, but possibly very effective. So again, here's a better picture of the political cartoon. So on April 19th, 1775, this is when the war actually broke out. The very first shot that actually started this Revolutionary War was April 19th, 1775. And this was actually something that wasn't necessarily planned, but it happened anyway. It was in Lexington, between Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. And at this time, this was after this point, this is a full-on war. The Second Continental Congress, so this was made up of representatives from almost every single colony, came together and voted to actually form a militia, which is a group of, at this time, it was a group of men who wanted to fight against the British, but they were really just like farmers and, various skilled workmen around the colonies. They were not officially trained. So George Washington was named the commander of the Continental Army, and that's what it ended up being called, the Continental Army. So we'll watch this another time, but this is one of those Schoolhouse Rocks cartoon videos about, the shot heard around the world. The shot heard around the world was what this shot of Lexington and Concord was nicknamed. We've already talked a little bit about the Declaration of Independence, but we'll talk much more about it. But the Declaration of Independence was basically a letter to King George and a letter to the British government saying, we want to be independent from you, and here's why. So the document is a list of reasons why the American colonists wanted independence, and it was a call for help against the King of England. Obviously, as I hope you know, because you probably heard this before, France came to the aid of the American colonists. Remember, France and England were very bitter enemies and had been for hundreds of years. So France came to the aid of the American colonists. So this is a chart comparing the two sides. Here you have Great Britain, or the Redcoats. Here you have the American colonies, or the Patriots, the Continental Army. And it gives you some clear advantages. So British advantages are in this box. They were the best navy in the world. They had well-trained soldiers. And then you have disadvantages for the British. They had to travel a very long distance to fight. They were overconfident against an inexperienced, Continental Army. They thought, oh, we're going to definitely win. So they underestimated their opponent. And then they had attrition. When men died in battle and materials or resources were lost, they didn't have any way, or it took a really long time for them to replace the people or the resources. Here you have the Continental Army, the Patriots, and their advantages were they fought close to home, they had a closer supply route, they had a lot of motivation. Basically, they were fighting to be independent. They were fighting for their independence from Great Britain. And then they also had the support of King Louis of France. That was huge. Then they had some disadvantages. They were poorly trained farmers acting as soldiers. They were not experienced at all. And, as you will see later, that cost them a lot of lives. And they had no army, so they relied on France's army. So that's important to note. So really, what I wanted you to know about the causes of the revolution were there were a lot of causes. And you'll get to know more of them through Chapter 3 Cornell Notes as well. But I just wanted you guys to have a little bit of an overview of that. Make sure that you do the questions that are in an attachment associated with this screencast. Have a good day.